dead of night on August 9, 1942, the pride of the Australian fleet was caught completely by surprise, illuminated by enemy flares and savaged by a phantom force she never had a chance to fight. This is the story of how that ship, His Majesty's Australian ship Canberra, a symbol of a nation's naval ambition, met its brutal end in the fiery chaos of the Pacific War, and how her sacrifice forged an unbreakable bond in the heat of battle. Her tale is not just one of tragedy, but a stark lesson in the unforgiving nature of naval combat, where a few minutes of confusion and unreadiness can lead to absolute disaster. To understand the life and death of HMAS Canberra, we must first go back to the aftermath of the Great War. The 1920s were a time of contradictions. The world was exhausted by conflict, yet the great powers were still jockeying for naval supremacy. To prevent a ruinously expensive new arms race, they came together to sign the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. This treaty placed strict limits on the size and armament of warships. For cruisers, the new gold standard was the treaty cruiser, a vessel displacing no more than 10,000 tons and armed with guns no larger than 8 inches in caliber. Britain, with its sprawling empire, embraced this new class of ship, designing the County-class heavy cruisers to patrol the vast trade routes that were its lifeblood. They were fast, long-legged ships, built more for endurance than for a toe-to-toe slugging match with a battleship. And it was from this lineage that Australia would receive its most powerful warship to date. The young Royal Australian Navy, or RAN, had distinguished itself in World War I, but its fleet was small and aging. To maintain a credible presence in the Pacific and to contribute to the defense of the British Empire, Australia ordered 2 of these new County-class cruisers. The first was HMAS Australia, and the second, laid down at the famous John Brown and Company shipyards on Clydebank in Scotland, would be named HMAS Canberra. Her construction cost a staggering £2 million. She was launched in May of 1927 and commissioned into the RAN just over a year later, in July 1928. From the moment she hoisted the Australian white ensign, Canberra was then just a warship. She was a statement. With a length of over 630 feet and a top speed of over 31 knots, she was a sleek and powerful symbol of a modernizing nation. Her main armament consisted of 8 8-inch guns, mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. This was supplemented by a secondary battery of 4-inch anti-aircraft guns and a collection of smaller automatic cannons. She carried torpedo tubes and could even launch a small seaplane for reconnaissance. But her protection was, like all treaty cruisers, a compromise. Her armor was thin, designed to protect her vitals from the shells of other cruisers, but it would prove tragically inadequate against the kind of punishment she would one day face. Throughout the 1930s, Canberra settled into her role as one of the premier ships of the RAN, often serving as its flagship. Her life was a cycle of patrols, training exercises, and showing the flag in ports across Asia and the Pacific. She cruised through the Dutch East Indies, visited Japan and China, and projected Australian presence and prestige wherever she went. It's easy to look back on these goodwill tours as quaint relics of a bygone era. But for a young nation like Australia, this ship was more than just a tool of war. It was a floating embassy, a projection of power and diplomacy on the world stage. For the sailors who served aboard her, it was a life of adventure, discipline, and pride in their magnificent ship. But the peaceful years were numbered. In Europe, the drums of war were beating again, and in September 1939, the shadow of conflict fell across the world once more. When World War II began, Canberra's mission changed overnight, from diplomacy to defense. Her initial assignments were close to home, conducting patrols and escorting troop convoys from Australia and New Zealand to the war zones in the Middle East and Europe. It was vital but unglamorous work, a constant vigil against an unseen threat. The primary danger in these early days came from German auxiliary cruisers, heavily armed merchant ships disguised to look harmless. These surface raiders prowled the lonely shipping lanes of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, sinking Allied merchantmen and sowing chaos. They were a perfect example of asymmetric warfare, and hunting them was like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. Canberra spent much of 1940 and 1941 on this vital task, steaming thousands of miles the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. She was based for a time in Fremantle, Western Australia, and operated as far as the coast of Africa. The patrols were long and often monotonous, punctuated by moments of high tension. In 1940, she was part of the hunt for the German pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, a far more powerful vessel that could have torn Canberra apart. Fortunately, they never met. The cruiser's search for raiders was often frustrating, coming close but never quite catching the elusive enemy. However, her persistence did pay off. In March of 1941, operating with the New Zealand cruiser HMNZS Leander, Canberra's luck changed. Her supermarine Walrus floatplane spotted two suspicious ships. They were the German supply vessel Coburg and a captured Norwegian tanker, the Ketty Brovig, both operating in support of the raider Atlantis. As Canberra closed in, the crews of the two enemy ships began to scuttle their vessels, setting demolition charges to sink them before they could be captured. Canberra opened fire, accelerating the sinking of the Coburg and recovering 40 German sailors from the water. The Ketty Brovig was also scuttled by her prize crew. It wasn't a dramatic cruiser versus cruiser duel, but it was a tangible victory. They had disrupted the enemy's vital logistics network, making the Indian Ocean a little safer for Allied shipping. These actions earned the ship and her crew a reputation for efficiency and vigilance. They had proven themselves in the patient, grinding work that defined the war at sea. Having proven her worth against the clandestine raiders of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, Canberra's greatest test was yet to come. The war was about to shift, pulling her from the vast, lonely expanses of the trade routes into the compressed, island-choked battlegrounds of the South Pacific, where a new and far more dangerous enemy was waiting. On the 7th of December, 1941, the Empire of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the war in the Pacific exploded into life. Australia was now on the front line, and HMAS Canberra was immediately redeployed to face the new threat. The early months of the Pacific War were a nightmare for the Allies. Japanese forces swept south with terrifying speed, overwhelming defenses in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. HMAS Canberra was thrown into the desperate fight, escorting convoys reinforcing Singapore and Java, and evacuating personnel from the crumbling defenses. In January 1942, she was part of a force that engaged Japanese invasion convoys off Malaya, but the action was inconclusive. The strategic situation was grim, with the Allies constantly retreating, outmaneuvered and outfought by the Imperial Japanese Navy. To better coordinate their disparate and battered naval forces, the Allies formed the Anzac Squadron in February 1942, which later evolved into Task Force 44. HMAS Canberra, along with her sister ship HMS Australia, became the core of this multinational force, operating alongside cruisers and destroyers from the United States Navy. This integration was a crucial step in the Pacific War, forging the close operational partnership between the Australian and American navies that continues to this day. Under the command of British Rear Admiral John Crace and later American Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, Task Force 44 spent the spring and summer of 1942 engaged in the grueling defense of New Guinea. They escorted troop convoys to Port Moresby and patrolled the Coral Sea, acting as a shield against further Japanese advances towards Australia. In May 1942, the task force played a supporting role in the pivotal Battle of the Coral Sea. While the American aircraft carriers Lexington and Yorktown slugged it out with their Japanese counterparts in the world's first carrier versus carrier battle, Canberra and her consorts were detached to intercept a Japanese invasion force headed for Port Moresby. The Japanese, hammered by the American carrier planes, turned back, and the invasion was thwarted. Though Canberra never fired her main guns in anger during the battle, her presence was a key part of the Allied strategy that secured a crucial, if costly, victory, halting the seemingly unstoppable Japanese tide for the first time. The intensity was ratcheting up. The ship and her crew were becoming seasoned veterans of the Pacific theater, but they were also growing weary. The constant threat of air and submarine attack, the humid tropical heat, and the endless days at sea took their toll. They were about to be sent into the heart of the storm. In August 1942, the Allies launched their first major offensive of the Pacific War, Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The strategic objective was to seize a nearly completed Japanese airfield on the island, which, if it became operational, would threaten the vital sea lanes between the United States and Australia. HMAS Canberra was assigned to the massive naval armada supporting the landings. Specifically, she was part of the screening force, Task Force 62.3, commanded by Rear Admiral Crutchley, a British officer flying his flag on HMAS Australia. Their job was to protect the vulnerable transport ships unloading thousands of U.S. Marines onto the beaches of Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi. The invasion on August 7th and 8th went relatively well, meeting lighter-than-expected resistance on the ground. The Japanese, however, reacted with lightning speed. Their land-based bombers from Roseville flew down the slot, the channel running through the Solomon Islands, and repeatedly attacked the Allied fleet. Canberra's anti-aircraft gunners were in constant action, firing at waves of Japanese bombers and defending the transports. But the real threat was not from the air. In response to the landings, the Japanese assembled a powerful surface strike force under the command of the brilliant and aggressive Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. His force consisted of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. Their mission was simple and brutal: to sail down the slot under the cover of darkness and annihilate the Allied naval screen, then sink the helpless transport ships at dawn. The Allied screening force was divided into 3 groups. The Northern Force, with 3 American heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, guarded the channel between Savo Island and Florida Island. The Southern Force, commanded directly by Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago, consisted of HMAS Canberra, the heavy cruiser USS Chicago, and 2 destroyers, the USS Patterson and the USS Bagley. A third group, the Eastern Force, was further away. 2 radar-equipped destroyers, the USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot, were also sent to patrol the western approaches to Savo Island, acting as an early warning picket line. On paper, it seemed like a solid defensive plan. In reality, it was a recipe for disaster. The Allied crews were exhausted. They had been at general quarters, their highest state of alert, for nearly 2 days straight during the landings and air attacks. Communications were poor, with no single radio frequency connecting all the ships in the screen. Crucially, the command structure was confused. On the evening of August 8th, the overall fleet commander, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, controversially decided to withdraw his aircraft carriers, the fleet's main protection against air attack and its only real long-range reconnaissance asset. That same evening, Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commander of the amphibious force, called a meeting aboard his flagship, forcing Rear Admiral Crutchley, the screen commander, to leave his post and travel to the transport area. This left Captain Bode on the USS Chicago in charge of the Southern Force, but it's unclear if everyone in the screening force even knew that. The chain of command was broken at the worst possible moment. So let me ask you this. You're a sailor on watch, exhausted after days at general quarters, staring into a pitch-black, humid night. What are you looking for? A periscope? A torpedo wake? Would you even be thinking about a full-blown surface fleet bearing down on you? The prevailing wisdom was that the Japanese were masters of torpedo attacks, but shied away from nighttime gunnery duels. This was a fatal miscalculation. As Mikawa's force steamed south at high speed, they were a well-oiled machine, trained to perfection in the art of night combat. The Allies, by contrast, were a collection of ships from different navies, with different procedures, tired crews, and a dangerous sense of complacency. Just after 1 in the morning on August 9th, Mikawa's cruisers slipped past the American destroyer pickets, who either failed to spot them or whose reports failed to get through. The Japanese admiral made a fateful decision. He would strike the southern group of Allied ships first. His lookouts, highly trained for night vision, spotted Canberra and Chicago silhouetted against the horizon. The Japanese launched their deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, weapons far superior to anything the Allies possessed. Then Mikawa gave the order to illuminate and open fire. Aboard HMAS Canberra, the world ended. The ship was not at general quarters. Most of the crew were asleep or at a lower state of readiness known as Condition 2. Suddenly, the night was torn apart. Flares dropped by Japanese float planes burst overhead, bathing the cruiser in an eerie, inescapable light. Almost simultaneously, the first shells from the Japanese cruiser Chokai slammed into Canberra's starboard side. Within the first minute, at least 2 torpedoes struck her, one below the forward turrets and another hitting the engine rooms. The explosions ripped through the thin hull, causing massive flooding and knocking out all electrical power. The ship went dark and silent, except for the roar of flames and the horrifying shriek of incoming shells. A storm of 8-inch and 5.5-inch shells, more than 24 in total, tore through Canberra's upper works in less than 2 minutes. They shredded the bridge, killing or wounding most of the officers there. Her captain, Frank Getting, was mortally wounded. The gunnery control positions were obliterated. The 8-inch guns, whose crews were desperately trying to get into action, were left powerless and silent, their turrets frozen in place. Fires raged uncontrollably through the ship, fed by fuel and ammunition. The scene was one of utter chaos and carnage. Sailors, roused from their sleep by the explosions, stumbled through dark, smoke-filled corridors, trying to fight fires and tend to the wounded with no power, no water pressure, and no central command. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The USS Chicago, steaming ahead of Canberra, was also hit by a torpedo in the bow but suffered far less damage. Her captain, for reasons that have been debated by historians for decades, failed to alert the rest of the fleet about the powerful enemy force that had just savaged them. Instead, he fired star shells in the wrong direction and briefly chased what he thought were enemy ships before turning away from the fight. Meanwhile, Mikawa's force, having crippled the southern group, turned north and fell upon the unsuspecting northern group of Allied cruisers. In the next hour, they would sink the American heavy cruisers USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes in one of the most one-sided and devastating defeats in the history of the United States Navy. As dawn broke over the tranquil-looking channel between Guadalcanal and Florida Island, the scale of the disaster became apparent. The sea was littered with debris, oil slicks, and the desperate survivors of 4 sunken cruisers. HMAS Canberra was still afloat, but she was a ruin. She had a heavy list to starboard, was down by the bow, and was burning fiercely from bow to stern. Her decks were a tangled mess of wreckage, and the cost in human lives was horrific. 10 officers and 74 sailors were killed, and another 109 were wounded. The destroyer USS Patterson came alongside, her crew fighting the fires on Canberra and beginning the difficult task of evacuating the survivors. It quickly became clear that the ship was doomed. Her engine rooms and boiler rooms were flooded, she had no power, and the fires were beyond control. With the threat of renewed Japanese air and surface attacks, the decision was made by the Allied command. Canberra could not be saved, and she could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. She had to be scuttled. The remaining crew, many of them injured and all of them exhausted and heartbroken, abandoned their ship. The final grim task fell to the U.S. Navy. The destroyer USS Selfridge was ordered to sink the hulk with torpedoes and gunfire. But Canberra refused to die. Selfridge fired 263 5-inch shells and 4 torpedoes into the crippled cruiser, but she remained stubbornly afloat. Finally, the destroyer USS Eliot was called in and fired another torpedo, which at last broke the ship's back. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, on August 9, 1942, HMAS Canberra rolled over to starboard and slipped beneath the waves, coming to rest more than 2,000 feet below the surface. She joined the growing collection of warships, both Allied and Japanese, that would give the body of water the grim and enduring name, Iron Bottom Sound. The Battle of Savo Island was a tactical masterpiece for the Japanese and a humiliating disaster for the Allies. The loss of 4 heavy cruisers and over 1,000 sailors in a single night sent shockwaves through the Allied command. An investigation known as the Hepburn Inquiry was launched, which highlighted the litany of failures. the exhaustion of the crews, the poor command and control, the ineffective communications, and the catastrophic underestimation of the enemy's capabilities. But from the ashes of this defeat, something remarkable grew. The sacrifice of HMAS Canberra and her crew was deeply felt in both Australia and the United States. In an unprecedented gesture of solidarity and respect, United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt personally requested that a new U.S. Navy warship be named in honor of the lost Australian cruiser. A Baltimore-class heavy cruiser, then under construction, was renamed the USS Canberra. She was launched in 1943, sponsored by the wife of the Australian ambassador, and went on to serve with distinction for the remainder of World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. She remains the only U.S. Navy warship ever to be named for a foreign capital city and a foreign warship. This act cemented a bond of mateship between the two navies, a bond forged in the fires of a shared and bitter defeat. The story of HMAS Canberra is a tragedy, a stark reminder of the brutal cost of war. But it is also a story of courage and of an alliance strengthened by mutual loss and respect, a legacy that sails on long after the guns of Savo Island fell silent. The loss of HMAS Canberra was a brutal lesson, but one that the Allies learned from. Naval tactics, particularly around night fighting, were completely overhauled. But what do you believe was the single greatest factor in her loss? Was it the element of surprise, the exhaustion of the crew, or the failures in the Allied command structure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe these stories of sacrifice and the hard-won lessons of history need to be remembered, then make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We have many more sorties into the past planned, and you won't want to miss a single one.